Hello, my friend. Glad you came to join me today. I thought we'd have some tea and have a little chat. The tea I have today is gunpowder green tea. It's one I've had for a long time. I have a little bit left. And the thing I thought I would talk today about is a little bit about genetics. So first, tea. I'm using my new teacup, which says, "I hope you are doing well." And I do hope you are doing well. This gunpowder green tea, it's called gunpowder because of the way it looks. But it's a green tea. I did that thing that many of us do, which is to not take the last little bit of something because it's the last little bit. No. Let's see if you can see that. This tea, as it's dried, it rolls up it. So it looks like little tiny pellets. That's why it's called gunpowder. I didn't get a tea bag out. I'm using these tea bags again. So they're compostable. In case you want to have tea growing in your compost. Get an extra. Okay. They have this diagonal cut at the top and a pleated bottom. You can actually fill these with a lot of tea. I'm only putting in a teaspoon though, because that's all I need for my 1 cup. The place where I get my tea also makes cloth tea bags that you can wash and reuse. I've thought about getting those as well, because I don't seem to do a good job reusing the mesh ones. I don't like to rinse them out. The cloth ones would be fairly simple just to throw in the wash. And these are long enough that you can fold them over the top of your cup. You have to be careful when you do this because the water will wick up the bag and it can actually drip down the side of your cup if you're not careful. And I have water over here, it's just off the boil, so I'm not going to touch it because it's pretty hot. But with green tea you don't want to put on super hot boiling water. And you also don't need to steep it for very long. Only a few minutes, actually. These are my favorite measuring spoons. They remind me of, they're kind of old-fashioned. They remind me of the ones I had when I was a kid. Don't get much more regular measuring spoon than this. This is pretty iconic, I think. So what people think of when they think of measuring spoons. Or maybe it's just me. No, there's still a tiny bit left in there. It's probably sitting in my cupboard for another year. I tend to drink jasmine green instead. So I don't even have a container for that one. I have a tin for my jasmine green that I get refilled. Okay, so while that's steeping, get started on genetics. So about genetics. So my ogre friend, which may be you, if it is, hi, and I were talking about genetics. It was a couple of months ago now, I think. We were talking about recessive genes. And so I thought I would make this video about a little bit about some of the basics of genetics and how it works. For anyone who might not really know. I find it very interesting. So I'm going to talk in a very that's good, vague way. I want to make it, let me be clear. Genetics isn't as simple as I'm going to explain it here. That was my Obama impression. There are what we call Mendelian genetics. It's named after the monk Mendel, who originally came up with the idea of inheritance, that traits were passed from parents to their offspring. And we didn't know about DNA at the time. We didn't know about genes at the time. We didn't have the microscopic data about how this works until fairly recently. So when he was doing his experiments, he didn't know about any of the actual how cells work and things like that. But he made a lot of really good observations and was able to explain a lot about how inheritance works without knowing that there was in fact material that was passed from parents to offspring that determined what their traits would be. So that's pretty interesting. So I'm going to pause here and switch to table view so that I can do some drawings with you. Okay. Okay, so here's the thing with Mendel. He was observing pea plants. And he observed that they had several different traits. They had their height, which could be tall or short. They had flowers. It could be purple or white. They had the pea color. It could be yellow or green. And the pea shape. It could be round or wrinkled. So luckily for us, peas actually have fairly simple genetics, at least along the traits that he was looking at. So the first and easiest one to explain is the flower color. This is what he did. He took peas that had purple flowers and then he cut the stamens off them, and he took pollen from the white flowers from the stamens on the white flowers. And he used that to make new pea plants, so to seed new plants. So basically he did a white times purple cross. Plants that had purple flowers mixed with plants that had white flowers. And what he observed, we call this the parental generation, by the way, P1. That's what we usually call that. The first filial generation. So the plants that came out of that all had purple flowers, which he thought was very interesting. Now, what he observed after that was even more interesting. If you took the plants that had purple flowers from the first filial generation, so these plants that were a result of the cross of purple and white, the second filial generation, so the progeny, the offspring, the children, if you will, of these plants produced mostly purple flowers, but some of the plants produced white flowers. And not only did that happen, but it happened in a ratio of 3 to 1. No matter how many times he did it, with whatever plants he did it with, you could count on that the ratio would be almost exactly 3 to 1. 3 purple plants, 1 white plant. So, what does this tell us about the genetics? If we look at the genetics of flower color and knowing what we know now about genes, this is how we explain it. Every cell has 2 copies. This is generally true. There are actually some organisms that have 1 copy or that have more than 2 copies. But generally speaking, most organisms, including humans and pea plants, have 2 copies of genetic material. The genetic material contains a set of genes, a complete set of genes. So you have 2 copies of a complete set of genes in every cell in your body. And that's the same with pea plants. They have the 2 copies of a complete set of genes for pea plant in every cell. Now each gene in that set of genes can come in different flavors. So there is a gene for flower color. We're going to name it P. This is going to be the flower color gene. So that flower color gene can come in one of 2 flavors. It can be purple, or it can be white, which we're going to show as little p here. Actually, I might not be able to do it that way, but... So, we call these alleles. The different flavors, or the different colors of a gene are called alleles. That's spelled like this. Alleles represent variations in genes. Genes are elements of DNA, elements of your genetic material, that are the code for particular components of your body, or in this case of a pea plant. So we have a gene for flower color, and there are 2 alleles. There's a purple one and there's a white one. Now, why did I make with a big P and a little p? I'll tell you. Because, and you may have heard of this before, the way we explain Mendel's observations is that purple flowers have 2 copies of the purple color gene. This is a bit of a long explanation. White flowers have 2 copies of the white flower color. I'm going to show that as 2 little p's. I'm putting the line under it so you can tell these are the little ones. Now when we cross these, what happens when we breed plants together, when we cross plants, this is the same thing with humans. You take half the genetic material from one, half the genetic material from the other, and they mix together. That means we can have only one outcome when we cross purple and white, which is big P and a little p. Now what happens with genetics in this very simple structure is that the purple color is what we see. That means that purple is actually the dominant color. So we write it as a big letter. Big letter P means purple is the dominant color. The little p, so we use a little p to show the recessive gene. So this one is dominant. And this one is recessive. And what that means is when you have 2 copies, if you have one dominant and one recessive, the dominant one will be the one that you see. This will be your dominant trait. Even though you have 2 copies, you only get one. You only see one. So what we see here are purple flowers. This is purple. And this is white. Okay. This is our P1, our parental generation. Okay. So we see all purple flowers. So when he crossed these, we didn't have any way of having a non-dominant allele mixed with, we didn't have any way of having a recessive allele mixed with another recessive allele because these were both dominant. So since we're taking half, our choices here are big P or big P, and our choices here are little p or little p. So the only way these can be put together is to have a big P and a little p, one from each. But when we cross this generation of purple flowers, we're actually crossing a big P and a little p. When we have 2 of the same allele, we call this, where can I write this? Homozygous. Homo meaning the same. Zygous is describing zygote. It's the, like, you can think of it as like the fundamental genetic material, genetic code. Homozygous. You have 2 of the same alleles. When we have one of each dominant and recessive allele, we call this heterozygous. That means hetero here meaning different. One of each. Same versus one of each. Okay? So when we cross these, now we have a choice over here of a P and a P, or a P and a little p. So a big P and a little p crossed with a big P and a little p. So what this gives us is you could have a big P and a big P, which would give you 2 big P's. You can have a big P and a little p, heterozygous. I kind of got that. You could have a little p and a big P, or you could have 2 little p's together. So what do we end up with here? A purple flower, a purple flower, a purple flower, and a white flower. Three purple possibilities and 1 white possibility, a ratio of 3 to 1. So, what's interesting about pea plants is that there are actually a lot of their genes that display this very simple dominance hierarchy. So you have 2 alleles, 1 is dominant, 1 is recessive, and when you blend them together, you get this 3 to 1 ratio. That is one very important concept about inheritance that we learned from Mendel and his observations with pea plants. So now you've learned a little bit about Mendel and his peas, and a little bit about genetics, and I hope you found it informative and interesting. I'll do a little bit more on it probably in the future. There's lots to talk about with genetics and why it's interesting and the different things that can happen. One thing that's pretty cool is like bees, how bees work. Those are pretty neat. And anyway, partial inheritance and codominance, things like that. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there about genetics that we can talk about in the future. If you have any interest, let me know.